As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful November evening in 1999, the bustling streets of Lahore began to quiet. The air hung heavy with an unseasonable chill, matching the somber mood that had gripped the city for months. Beneath the surface calm, an undercurrent of fear pulsed through every neighborhood, every household. For nearly half a year, whispers had circulated about missing children, dozens of them, vanishing without a trace. Parents clutched their little ones closer, eyeing strangers with suspicion. Street vendors, once friendly faces in the community, now found themselves under scrutiny. The playgrounds, usually filled with the joyous laughter of children, stood eerily empty as the sun set. In the narrow alleys of the old city and the wide boulevards of newer districts alike, missing posters fluttered in the evening breeze. Each bore the face of a young boy, eyes full of hope and promise, unaware of the cruel fate that awaited them. Behind closed doors, mothers wept silently, fathers paced restlessly, and siblings clung to fading memories of brothers who might never return. No one could have imagined the horrifying truth that was about to come to light, a truth that would shake Pakistan to its very core and leave an indelible mark on the nation's psyche for generations to come. The Lahore police station was a hive of activity, even in the late hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn desks and filing cabinets that lined the walls. Officers shuffled papers, fielded calls, and processed the usual parade of petty criminals. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of stale coffee. Senior Officer Malik suppressed a yawn as he sorted through the day's mail. Bills, interdepartmental memos, the usual bureaucratic detritus. His eyes barely registered the unmarked envelope as he tore it open, expecting yet another mundane communication. As he unfolded the letter inside, however, his demeanor changed dramatically. His eyes widened, the color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. "Sir," he called out, his voice trembling, breaking the monotonous hum of the station. "You need to see this." The letter, written in a neat, almost scholarly hand, began with a chilling declaration. "My count ends at 100. My mission is complete here. My message will reach the entire world. I will make hundreds of mothers cry. I will send their children to the next world through the gutter without a coffin." What followed was a meticulous list, names, addresses, and grisly details of how each victim met their end. The handwriting remained steady throughout, as if the author were compiling a grocery list rather than confessing to unimaginable atrocities. At the bottom, an address stood out like an accusation: 16 billion, Ravi Road. Deputy Superintendent of Police Tariq Kembo felt his stomach lurch as he read the letter, passed to him by a visibly shaken Malik. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications sank in. Could this be real? 100 children. It seemed impossible, yet the details were too specific to ignore. Kembo's mind raced. If this was true, they were dealing with the worst serial killer in Pakistan's history. But if it was a hoax, it was a cruel one that would give false hope to hundreds of grieving families. Either way, they had to act fast. "Get a team ready," he barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen over the station. "We're going to 16 billion Ravi Road, now." Within the hour, Kembo and a team of officers arrived at the quiet house on Ravi Road. The neighborhood was unremarkable middle-class homes with small gardens, the occasional stray cat prowling the sidewalks. A few curious neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, wondering what could have brought such a police presence to their quiet street. Nothing in the scene before them suggested the horrors that might lie behind the door of number 16 billion. The house itself was nondescript, a two-story building with peeling paint and a small, unkempt garden. A rusty bicycle leaned against the wall, and faded curtains obscured the windows. Kembo took a deep breath, steeling himself for what they might find inside. He nodded to his team, and they took up positions around the house. With a silent count of 3, he raised his fist and knocked firmly on the door. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Kembo could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Then, slowly the door creaked open. A man in his late 30s stood before them, his demeanor unnervingly calm and collected. He was of average height and build, with a neatly trimmed beard and glasses that gave him an almost scholarly appearance. Nothing about him screamed monster. "Yeah, Javed Iqbal," Kembo asked, his hand instinctively moving closer to his holstered weapon. The man nodded, his eyes betraying a flicker of. "Was it amusement?" "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice smooth and cultured. "How can I help you, officers?" Kembo's mind raced. This man didn't fit the profile of a crazed killer. He seemed too ordinary, too composed. But appearances could be deceiving. "We need to ask you some questions about a letter we received," Kembo began, studying Javed's face for any reaction. For a moment, Javed's expression remained neutral. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, a transformation came over him. His calm facade cracked, revealing something manic underneath. In a flash, he had a gun pressed to his own temple, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Leave now," he snarled. "All pretense of civility gone. Or, I'll pull the trigger. You'll never know the truth if I'm dead, will you?" Caught off guard by the sudden shift, Kembo and his team retreated, their training kicking in to de-escalate the situation. All right, Kembo said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "We're leaving. Just stay calm." As they backed away, Javed slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. Kembo and his team regrouped at their vehicles, shaken by the encounter. It was a decision that would haunt him for years to come. They had been face to face with a monster and let him slip away. "Set up surveillance," Kembo ordered, his voice tight with frustration. "I want eyes on this house 24/7, and get me everything you can on Javed Iqbal. I want to know his whole life story by morning." As they drove away, Kembo couldn't shake the image of Javed's eyes in that moment of madness. He had seen something there, something that chilled him to his core. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man capable of anything. Little did Kembo know that their brief encounter had set in motion a chain of events that would shock the nation and reveal the full extent of Javed Iqbal's depravity. 3 days after the police's confrontation with Javed Iqbal, fate intervened in the form of a brown paper package delivered to the offices of the Daily Jung newspaper. The newsroom was its usual hive of activity reporters hunched over keyboards, phones ringing incessantly, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the buzz of the latest stories. Jamil Chishti, the chief crime reporter, was deep in conversation with a source when the package arrived. At first, he barely glanced at it, assuming it was just another press release or tip from an overzealous reader. But as he absent-mindedly tore open the brown paper, he found himself staring at its contents with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Photographs spilled out onto his desk, dozens of them, each showing a young boy. Some were smiling, caught in moments of innocent joy, unaware of their fate. Others looked frightened, their eyes pleading for help that would never come. Chishti's hands shook as he sifted through the images, each one a punch to the gut. Accompanying the photos was a diary, its 32 pages filled with meticulous details of unspeakable crimes. The handwriting was neat, almost beautiful in its precision, a stark contrast to the horrors it described. Chishti, a veteran reporter who thought he'd seen it all, felt his stomach churn as he read account after account of abduction, abuse, and murder. But it was the letter enclosed with the package that truly drove home the magnitude of what he was dealing with. Today, my goal is to kill 100 children. You will get a picture of all those children with you. Who are they and where are they from? I want you to tell the world through your newspaper what I did. I am giving you my 32-page diary. It is a complete confession of my 100 murders. If you go to my house, you will get all the evidence. When you find out what I did, the whole world will be shaken. Chishti's mind reeled. He had covered countless crimes in his career, seen the depths of human depravity. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. 100 children, their lives snuffed out by a single individual. It seemed impossible. Yet the evidence before him was undeniable. For a moment, he sat frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. Then, his journalistic instincts kicked in. He knew he had to act fast, not just for the sake of the story, but for the families of those children, for justice itself. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone. His first call was to his editor, explaining in hushed, urgent tones what he'd received. His second call was to his contact in the police department. As he dialed, his eyes fell on the address mentioned in the letter, 16 billion Ravi Road. He knew that's where he needed to go next. As he hung up the phone and grabbed his coat, Chishti felt a mix of dread and determination. He was about to step into the heart of darkness to uncover a story that would shake Pakistan to its core. But he also knew that in doing so, he might finally bring closure to hundreds of grieving families and help bring a monster to justice. With one last look at the photographs spread across his desk, young faces that would haunt his dreams for years to come, Chishti headed out into the Lahore night, towards 16 billion Ravi Road and the horrors that awaited him there. As Jamil Chishti's car pulled up to 16 billion Ravi Road, the streetlights cast long shadows across the unremarkable facade of the house. The night was unusually quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to be discovered. Chishti had seen his share of crime scenes over the years, but something about this one made his skin crawl even before he stepped out of the car. Perhaps it was the ordinary nature of the house, a place where such extraordinary evil had allegedly taken place. The police, paralyzed by bureaucracy and perhaps fear, had yet to arrive. Chishti knew he was potentially contaminating a crime scene, but the weight of the 100 lives lost drove him forward. He approached the front door, heart pounding. It was locked, of course. Chishti circled the house, looking for another way in. A partially open window at the back caught his eye. Desperation overriding caution, he managed to squeeze through, landing with a soft thud in what appeared to be a small storage room. The first thing that hit him was the smell of acrid, chemical odor that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. It was a smell he would never forget, one that would haunt his dreams for years to come. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, the true horror of the scene began to reveal itself. Shoes. Dozens upon dozens of children's shoes lined up neatly against the wall. Chishti found himself counting them mechanically, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos. 85 pairs in total, he would later recall. Each pair a silent testament to a young life cut brutally short. Moving further into the house, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, Chishti found himself in what must have been the living room. Here, sacks bulged with children's clothing. T-shirts, shorts, school uniforms, all neatly folded as if awaiting their owner's return. The domesticity of it, the care taken in folding these garments, stood in stark contrast to the evil that had transpired here. But it was the back room that held the most terrible secrets. Large drums stood in a row, filled with a bubbling, foul-smelling liquid. Acid, and floating in that hellish brew, Chishti could make out remains. He recoiled, fighting the urge to vomit. The realization of what he was seeing, the final resting place of so many innocent children, was almost too much to bear. On the walls, index cards were meticulously arranged. Each bore a name, a date, and horrifying details of a child's final moments. The handwriting was neat, almost beautiful, the same as in the diary he had received. One card caught Chishti's eye. "I didn't completely dissolve some of the bodies, so that the authorities can confirm them." The clinical detachment of the statement, the careful planning it implied, sent a chill down Chishti's spine. This wasn't the work of a madman in the throes of passion. This was calculated, methodical, evil in its purest form. As he stumbled out of the house, gasping for fresh air, Chishti's mind reeled. How could someone do this? And how had they gotten away with it for so long? The scale of the tragedy was almost beyond comprehension. 100 young lives snuffed out, 100 families destroyed. Leaning against his car, Chishti pulled out his phone with trembling hands. He had calls to make to the police, to his editor, to the families who had been waiting for answers for so long. But for a moment, he just stood there, letting the cool night air wash over him, trying to process what he had seen. He knew that what he had discovered in that house would change everything. The story he was about to break would shock the nation, bring a killer to justice, and hopefully bring some measure of closure to the families of the victims. But he also knew that the images he had seen, the horrors he had witnessed, would stay with him forever. As sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling the approach of the authorities, Chishti took a deep breath. The night was far from over. The story of Javed Iqbal and his unspeakable crimes was only beginning to unfold. And Jamil Chishti, veteran crime reporter, found himself at the center of what would become one of the most shocking and tragic cases in Pakistan's history. To understand the depravity of Javed Iqbal's crimes, one must delve into the twisted path that led him to become Pakistan's most notorious serial killer. His story is a chilling reminder that monsters are not born, but made, shaped by a complex interplay of nature, nurture, and circumstance. Born in 1956 to a wealthy Lahore family, Javed Iqbal entered the world with every advantage. His father, a successful businessman, provided a life of comfort and opportunity for his large family. Javed was the sixth of 9 children, growing up in a household that, from the outside, seemed the very picture of respectability. From an early age, Javed displayed a keen intelligence that set him apart. Teachers noted his quick mind and ability to absorb information rapidly, but along with that brilliance came a darkness that would only grow with time. Childhood friends would later recall a boy who was often withdrawn, prone to sudden mood swings and flashes of cruelty. Javed's childhood was marked by constant comparisons to his siblings, a common occurrence in large families, but one that seemed to affect him more deeply than most. His older brothers were athletic and popular, his sisters obedient and studious. Javed, by contrast, was a loner, more comfortable with books than with people. This constant comparison fostered a deep-seated resentment and aggression that would simmer beneath the surface for years. As he entered his teenage years, Javed's behavior became increasingly erratic. He developed obsessive tendencies, insisting on arranging his possessions in precise patterns and flying into rages if they were disturbed. More disturbingly, he began to exhibit a fascination with power and control, often bullying younger children in the neighborhood. Perhaps the most chilling incident from this period came when Javed was 15. His mother, recounting the story years later to investigators, described waking up in the middle of the night to find Javed standing over her bed, staring at her with an unnerving intensity. When she asked what he was doing, he calmly replied, "I was wondering what it would be like if you never woke up." The incident was dismissed as teenage moodiness at the time, but in retrospect, it was a sinister harbinger of things to come. As Javed entered adulthood, his deviant sexual tendencies began to manifest more clearly. He was drawn to young boys, a predilection that would shape his business ventures in terrifying ways. Despite this, he made attempts to conform to societal expectations. He married twice, but both unions ended within a year, unable to mask his true nature or quell his dark urges. His father, still hoping to channel Javed's energy into something productive, set him up with an iron business. But Javed had other plans. He began hiring young boys, ostensibly to save on labor costs. The real reason, as would later become clear, was far more sinister. It gave him easy access to vulnerable children, away from prying eyes. As Javed's wealth grew, so did his opportunities to indulge his dark desires. In the mid-1980s, he opened an arcade in a bustling area of Lahore. Filled with the latest video games, it quickly became a popular hangout for local children, especially those from poorer families who couldn't afford such entertainment at home. The arcade was Javed's hunting ground, a place where he could observe and select his victims at leisure. He perfected his technique for luring children, using a mix of bribes, threats, and manipulation. One favorite tactic was to place a 100 rupee note on the floor, then accuse a child of stealing when they inevitably picked it up. He would take them to a back room, ostensibly to search them, and there the abuse would begin. As parents became wary of the arcade, sensing something amiss, Javed adapted. He opened a gym, targeting slightly older boys with promises of building strength and attracting girls. Later, he added an aquarium to his business portfolio, using the lure of exotic fish to draw in curious children. But by 1997, Javed's carefully constructed world was crumbling. The costs of maintaining his facade and satisfying his perverse desires had drained his finances. Forced to sell his properties, he moved to a poorer area of Lahore, closer to his new hunting grounds, the streets where homeless and runaway children congregated. It was in this new phase of his life that Javed Iqbal's sadistic tendencies escalated from abuse to murder. The catalyst came in the form of an 18-year-old boy he had lured from Datha Darbar, a famous Sufi shrine that attracted scores of runaway and street children. After subjecting the teenager to his usual abuse, Javed fell asleep. But this victim fought back. In the dead of night, he struck Javed with the butt of a rifle, leaving him bleeding and unconscious. The commotion alerted neighbors, and soon the police were involved. The incident led to Javed's arrest on charges of rape. In a society where such crimes often went unpunished, especially when the victims were street children, the fact that Javed faced consequences at all was unusual. The punishment was severe 100 lashes that left him in a coma for 22 days. As he lay in the hospital, abandoned by his family save for his weeping mother, something snapped inside Javed Iqbal. The humiliation of the arrest, the physical pain of the punishment, and the rejection by his family coalesced into a burning rage. He emerged from his coma a changed man. The demon that had always lurked beneath the surface now took full control. Javed Iqbal was no longer content with abuse now. He craved murder. From May to November 1999, Lahore became Javed Iqbal's hunting ground. In just 147 days, 100 children would fall victim to his insatiable bloodlust. It was a spree of violence unprecedented in Pakistan's history, one that would leave deep scars on the nation's psyche. His method was always the same, refined through years of predatory behavior. He would approach children at bus stops or near Datha Darbar, offering them food, money, or a place to stay. Many of his victims were runaways or street children, those least likely to be missed. Once he had gained their trust, he would bring them back to his rented house on Ravi Road. There, in a grotesque parody of care, he would first photograph them, a memento of what was to come. He would feed them, sometimes even buying them new clothes. Then, inevitably, came the abuse. But unlike before, Javed no longer stopped there. With a brutality that defies comprehension, he would strangle his victims with a chain. Some he killed quickly, others he tortured first, reveling in their fear and pain. But death was not the end of the horror. Javed would then dissolve the bodies in drums of hydrochloric acid, erasing all traces of his young victims. It was a method both practical and symbolic, a final act of power over the children he had destroyed. As the body count rose, so did Javed's confidence. He began to see himself not just as a killer, but as an artist crafting a masterpiece of horror. Each murder was meticulously documented, each victim's details carefully preserved on index cards that adorned his walls like macabre trophies. In his diary, later recovered by police, Javed wrote, "I am not ashamed of my actions. I have set a new record in Pakistan's history. I have sent 100 children into the next world. Let the people decide if I am a beast or a human." As news of Javed's confession letter and the grisly discoveries at his house spread, Lahore descended into a state of shock and chaos. Parents of missing children flocked to 16 billion Ravi Road, their anguished cries filling the air as they recognized shoes, clothes, and school bags belonging to their lost little ones. The police, caught flat-footed by the scale of the crimes, launched the biggest manhunt in Pakistan's history. Every officer was mobilized, every informant pressed for information. Javed Iqbal's face was plastered across newspapers and television screens nationwide. Deputy Superintendent Kembo, still haunted by his earlier encounter with Javed, took personal charge of the investigation. "We will find him," he promised the grieving families. "No matter where he hides, we will bring him to justice." For days, the city held its breath. Schools remained closed, playgrounds empty. Parents kept their children indoors, terrified that the monster might still be lurking in their midst. The usual bustle of Lahore's streets was replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the wail of police sirens. As the investigation progressed, the full horror of Javed's crimes became apparent. Forensic teams worked around the clock, analyzing the acid drums, matching DNA from the partial remains to missing children reports. The index cards on Javed's walls provided a chilling roadmap of his killing spree, each entry a life cut tragically short. But even as the evidence mounted, Javed Iqbal remained elusive. Sightings were reported across the country, from the mountains of the north to the coast in the south. Each lead was frantically pursued, only to end in disappointment. Then, just as suddenly as he had vanished, Javed Iqbal resurfaced. On December 30th, 1999, he walked into the offices of the Daily Jung newspaper. The newsroom fell silent as he announced, "I am Javed Iqbal, the murderer of 100 children." For hours, he sat with journalists, calmly recounting his crimes in chilling detail. "I hate this world," he declared, his voice devoid of emotion. "And I have no complaints about my actions." When asked why he had stopped at 100 victims, Javed's response was as cold as it was horrifying. "I still had so much money. I could have continued this." As word spread of Javed's surrender, a crowd gathered outside the newspaper office. Police had to force their way through the throng, some of whom were calling for Javed to be lynched on the spot. The man who had terrorized Lahore for months was finally in custody, but the nightmare was far from over. The trial of Javed Iqbal was a media sensation, drawing attention from around the world. As details of his crimes emerged, the nation grappled with a mix of horror, grief, and a thirst for vengeance. In a surprising twist, Javed pleaded not guilty, claiming his confession was a hoax designed to draw attention to the plight of street children. Later, he changed his story again, insisting that 20 mysterious men had committed the murders in his home while he watched helplessly. But the evidence was overwhelming. The shoes, the clothes, the acid-filled drums, and most damningly, Javed's own meticulous records all pointed to his guilt. Eyewitnesses came forward, describing how they had seen Javed with various victims shortly before they disappeared. On March 16, 2000, Judge Allah Bakhsh Ranja delivered a verdict that would go down in legal history. Javed Iqbal was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was unprecedented. He would be executed in a manner mirroring his own cruelty. Javed was to be strangled in front of the parents of his victims, his body cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid. The sentence sent shockwaves around the world. Human rights organizations decried it as barbaric, while many in Pakistan saw it as fitting retribution for Javed's unimaginable crimes. The case sparked intense debate about the nature of justice, the limits of punishment, and how society should deal with such extreme acts of evil. As the controversy raged and appeals were filed, Javed Iqbal's story came to an abrupt and mysterious conclusion. On October 8, 2001, he was found dead in his cell along with his accomplice, Sajid Ahmed. Official reports claimed suicide. The two had allegedly hanged themselves with bedsheets. But suspicions immediately arose. Both men had died at exactly the same time, and curiously, the SECT cameras monitoring the cell had been switched off between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. that night. Had Javed Iqbal cheated justice by taking his own life? Or had someone decided to mete out punishment away from the public eye? The truth may never be known, adding a final layer of mystery to a case already shrouded in darkness. The case of Javed Iqbal left deep scars on the psyche of Pakistan. It exposed the vulnerability of street children and forced a national reckoning with issues of child protection and welfare. In the years since, laws have been tightened and awareness of child abuse has increased. Organizations working with street children received increased funding and support. The government implemented new programs aimed at identifying and helping at-risk youth. But for the families of Javed's victims, no change can erase the pain of their loss. Support groups formed, providing a space for grieving parents to share their sorrow and fight for remembrance of their lost children. Today, more than 2 decades later, the name Javed Iqbal still has the power to send shivers down spines in Lahore. His crimes serve as a dark reminder of the evil that can lurk behind an ordinary facade, and the terrible price paid when society fails its most vulnerable members. The story of Javed Iqbal is more than just a tale of horror. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of mental health support, the dangers of ignoring red flags, and the need for robust systems to protect at-risk children. It raises uncomfortable questions about how a single individual could commit such atrocities over an extended period without detection. It challenges us to look at the invisible children in our societies, the runaways, the homeless, the neglected, and ask ourselves how we can better protect them. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. In the wake of unimaginable tragedy, the people of Lahore came together. Support groups formed for grieving families. Charitable organizations redoubled their efforts to help street children. A city once paralyzed by fear began the long, difficult process of healing. The shadow of Javed Iqbal's crimes may never fully lift from Lahore, but in its darkness, pinpricks of light emerge. A community united in grief, a renewed commitment to protecting the innocent, and a determination to ensure that such horrors never happen again. As we reflect on this dark chapter in Pakistan's history, we are reminded of the words often attributed to Edmund Burke: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The story of Javed Iqbal stands as a stark warning of what can happen when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of society's most vulnerable members. It is a call to action, a reminder that each of us has a responsibility to be vigilant, to speak up, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Only then can we hope to prevent future monsters from emerging from the shadows to prey on the innocent. In the end, the tale of Javed Iqbal is not just about one man's depravity. It's about a society's failure to protect its children, about the long-lasting trauma inflicted on families and communities, and about the difficult path towards healing and prevention. It's a story that continues to resonate, serving as a grim reminder of the depths of human evil and the importance of safeguarding the most vulnerable among us. As Lahore continues to grapple with the legacy of these horrific crimes, one can only hope that the lessons learned will lead to a safer future for all children, and that the memory of the 100 young lives lost will serve as a permanent call to vigilance and compassion.